Thank you. Thank you. Good evening, everyone. I'm very sorry for the slight delay. As you saw, the weather was atrocious and a lot of people were late, so we now have more or less a packed house. And I'd like to welcome you tonight on behalf of the organizing committee of the Edward Said annual lecture, Mariam Said, who will introduce Professor Chomsky, Mary Kay Wilmers, who I haven't seen yet, I hope she's here, Ahdaf Suwaif, and Jacqueline Rose. Also on behalf of the London Review of Books and the Al-Qattan Foundation, I welcome you tonight. This is our fourth lecture in a series, which I hope will go on for many years. And tonight we present Professor Chomsky speaking about violence and dignity, reflections on the Middle East. Professor Chomsky needs no introduction. For over 60 years, he's helped generations of citizens, including students, activists, and intellectuals, unravel and analyze some of the most challenging and complex questions facing them, facing us, and in an astonishing number of disciplines, ranging from linguistics to international relations and so on. But it is his principled engagement with and struggle against injustice throughout these years that have made his insights so very forceful and necessary, helping many of us in our attempts not only to better understand the world, but to also strive to make it more just and equitable. Before we begin, however, I'd also like to thank Mary Kay Wilmers again and the London Review of Books for their fantastic and generous support to us this year, to Fiona McMurrough and her team who have handled press relations so very effectively, and the Mosaic Rooms team who have worked tirelessly to make this evening a success. I think you can see that we're already there more or less. Professor Chomsky will be introduced by Mariam and will speak for approximately 40 minutes. He'll then take a small number of questions afterwards. He has also very generously signed a limited number of copies of his new book, Power Systems, which are available to purchase in the outside hall. Please join me in welcoming Mariam Said.
I would like to start by thanking all the people Omar thanked, from the London Review of Books to the team who made all this possible, and also the Al-Qattan Foundation, who has been our biggest supporter from the inception of this lecture series. Good evening, everybody. We all know that Professor Noam Chomsky needs no introduction. I will try to be as brief as I can in order not to take too much of his time. Renowned academics, public intellectuals, activists, and humanists are the words used to describe Noam Chomsky and my late husband, Edward Said. Exceptional people with vision, responsible intellectuals whose interpretations on what is taking place in the real world is unique and different. Their respected fields had to do with the importance of language. Chomsky as a linguist and Edward as a literary critic. What they say is always clear and precise. Noam and Edward met in the 1960s and over the years maintained an off and on conversation on various subjects, including current affairs and policy formation. At some point, they toyed with the idea of collaborating together on a book. Both were very busy. Unfortunately, this idea never materialized. The telephone, the Xerox machine, and the mail were the only means of communication during the 1960s and 70s. Copies of hard-to-find printed information, such as newsletters or translations of foreign language articles, would be sent by mail. Edward and Noam had a friend who was a very important source of this kind of alternate information. His name was Israel Shahak, an Israeli professor of chemistry, a Holocaust survivor, a remarkable man who spent hours and hours every day translating from Hebrew to English newspaper articles that appeared in the Israeli press and commenting on them. In the beginning, he would write his translations by hand. Eventually, he accepted to use the typewriter. Both Edward and Noam were recipients of his diligent work, and his analysis challenged them and others to probe further. Nowadays, we are privileged to have the world of cyberspace. News and images are received instantly, thanks to the internet and cellular phones with cameras. However, it takes a very long time to sift through the massive amounts of alternate information. Edward was getting overwhelmed with the barrage of information. Noam introduced him to a wonderful woman called Shifra Stern, a paralegal by profession, and like Israel Shahak, had taken it upon herself to provide others with hard-to-find information. Shifra spends hours on the internet compiling information from unknown sources and emails her output to people like Noam and Edward. During the last few years of his life, Edward would eagerly await Shifra's input, and after going through her package would say to me, "Shifra is amazing." Before Edward passed away, he wrote a new preface for the 25-year anniversary edition of Orientalism, and I quote, "And lastly, most important, humanism is the only, and I would go as far as to say, the final resistance we have against the inhuman practices and injustices that disfigure human history." We are most privileged to have with us tonight a rare voice with deep insight and intuition. Please join me in welcoming Professor Noam Chomsky, the most prolific humanist and resistor, whose valuable work over 60 years encompasses the whole globe and reaches the furthest corners of the earth. Thank you.
Thank you, Mariam. A Swedish novelist, Henning Mankell, tells of an experience in Mozambique at the peak of the hideous atrocities of the apartheid era. He describes how he was walking towards the village, he saw a man walking towards him in ragged clothes. In his words, in his deep misery, the wretched survivor had painted shoes on his feet in a way to defend his dignity when everything was lost. He had found the colors from the earth, and he had painted shoes on his feet. Scenes like that will evoke many poignant memories among people who've witnessed cruelty and degradation, and also the steady resistance of the Samidin, borrow Raja Shahada's term for those who endure, remarkable book on Palestinians under occupation 30 years ago. Like many of you, and in fact much less than many of you, I've witnessed many scenes like that throughout the world over many years. Once again, last October, when I was able to visit Gaza for the first time. I'd tried earlier but couldn't make it. Greeting me on my return home were the reports on the latest outburst of shocking crimes, the November Israeli assault, supported by the United States and tolerated politely by Europe as usual. One of the first reports I received was a photograph by a young Gaza journalist, a man I've known for some years, who I met again in Gaza. The photograph showed a doctor in a hospital ward holding the hideously charred corpse of a murdered infant. The doctor is the director and a head of surgery at the Khan Yunis hospital in south of Gaza, where actually a few days earlier I had heard his passionate appeal for drugs and surgical equipment so that patients would not have to writhe in agony while awaiting simple surgery that cannot be performed for lack of facilities. As the November attack exploded, the United Nations released its weekly review of the permanent humanitarian crisis in Gaza. It reported that 40% of essential drugs are out of stock, consequence of the Israeli blockade and Western complicity, which we should not forget, and the unwillingness of the new Egyptian government to offend the masters. It appears that according to credible reports, that the borders are still under the control of Mubarak's dreaded Mukhabarat, secret police, which is closely linked to the CIA and Israeli Mossad. Just last week, I received another article by the same Gaza journalist, which you may have seen, describing the terrible impact of the Morsi government's latest assault against the people of Gaza. It has devised a new way to block the tunnels that are a lifeline for people imprisoned under harsh siege and constant attack, flooding them with filthy sewage. The same day's news brought a report by the Israeli human rights group B'Tselem on a new device adopted by the Israeli army to overcome the ingenuity of the Samidin in coping with tear gas, spraying protesters and homes with powerful jets of raw sewage. This is punishment for the weekly nonviolent protests against Israel's illegal separation wall, actually an annexation wall. So more evidence that great minds have similar thoughts, in this case combining criminal repression with a useful humiliation. The tragedy of Gaza dates back to 1948. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians fled in terror or were forcibly expelled across the border by the conquering Israeli forces. They actually continued to truck them across the border after the official ceasefire for at least 4 years, we've recently learned. Recent Israeli scholarship, notably the very important work of Avi Raz, cites documentary evidence that the government's goal was to drive the refugees into the Sinai, and if feasible, also the rest of the population of Palestine. These long-standing goals may well be a factor contributing to Egypt's reluctance to open the border to free passage of people and goods barred by the cruel Western-backed Israeli siege. Getting rid of the Arabs of Gaza was only one facet of much broader goals. During the 1948 expulsions, Israeli government Arabists predicted that the refugees would either assimilate elsewhere or would be crushed and die, while most of them would turn into human dust and the waste of society and join the most impoverished classes in the Arab countries. As for the Arabs of what we call the land of Israel themselves, Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion held that they have only one function left to them, to run away. The causes of the refugee flight are no longer seriously in question. There are very few who would question the conclusions of the most prominent Israeli historian of the topic, Benny Morris. In his words, the refugee problem was caused by attacks by Jewish forces on Arab villages and towns and by the inhabitants' fear of such attacks, compounded by expulsions, atrocities, rumors of atrocities, and by the crucial Israeli cabinet decision in June 1948, right in the middle of the atrocities, to bar refugee return, leaving the Palestinians crushed with some 700,000 driven into exile. Morris is critical of Israeli atrocities, in part because they're too limited. Ben-Gurion's great error, he says, perhaps a fatal mistake, was not to have cleansed the whole country, the whole land of Israel, as far as the Jordan River. There's actually evidence, just appeared in the last few days, from recently declassified Israeli cabinet records that Ben-Gurion apparently had the same reaction to the failure, the fatal mistake of not completing the purification of the land, as it's called. From the earliest days, Arabs were regarded as an alien implant in the land of Israel. As the Balfour Declaration was released, Chaim Weizmann, who, as you know, Israel's first president, the most respected Zionist figure, he remarked that the British had informed him that in Palestine there are a few 100,000 Negroes, Schwarzes, actually, he said, but that's a matter of no significance. Weizmann, in turn, had informed Lord Balfour that the issue known as the Arab problem in Palestine will be of merely local character, and in effect, anyone cognizant of the situation does not consider it a highly significant factor. So displacement of the inhabitants by a Jewish settlement raises no moral issue. A later president, Israeli president, Chaim Herzog, also incidentally a labor dove, he articulated the basic guidelines in 1972. The date's important. This is often attributed to Menachem Begin and Likud, but it's not. It's an old Labor Party program. He said, I do not deny the Palestinians any place or stand or opinion on every matter, but certainly I am not prepared to consider them as partners in any respect in a land that has been consecrated in the hands of our nation for thousands of years. For the Jews of this land, there cannot be any partner. That's the doves that I'm quoting, the humanists. Lord Balfour himself, who was a devoted Christian Zionist, he expressed similar views. These were actually quite a common element of elite Christian Zionism, which long predates Jewish Zionism. It included leading figures in the United States as well. That was primarily a British phenomenon. They were immersed in the Holy Book with lessons that the land of Israel was promised to the Jews. Others are interlopers, Woodrow Wilson, and Harry Truman, many others. That's, for example, why one of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's leading advisors, an important cabinet member, described the Jewish return to Palestine as the most remarkable event in history. In the United States, a traditional elite Christian Zionism is now buttressed by an enormous right-wing Christian movement, passionately pro-Israel, deeply anti-Semitic, forms much of the current base of the current Republican Party. It's important to recognize that, to understand lots of things that take place regularly, like the Chuck Hagel hearings a few weeks ago. Christian Zionism is an important factor in shaping policy towards Israel-Palestine from early years. There are others. It's noteworthy, for example, that the strongest support for Israel in the international arena comes from the countries that are called the Anglosphere, Britain and its offshoots, US, Canada, and Australia. These are unusual in the history of imperialism, and that they're settler colonial societies based on extermination or expulsion of indigenous populations in favor of a higher race. And in them, such behavior is kind of instinctively considered natural and praiseworthy. So what Israel's doing looks entirely normal, quite apart from the religious element. Now, the crucial factors, certainly since 1967, are strategic and economic and still prevail, but others shouldn't be overlooked. Well, going back to Gaza, after Israel's 1967 conquests, its torture took new forms, too many, too awful to review. all seemed to be pretty much under control until December 1987, when the Intifada suddenly broke out, first in Gaza, spreading quickly throughout the territories, largely nonviolent. It stimulated quite impressive popular organization. Anyone who visited, I was there, could see that. Large respects, revolt against the feudal society, the Palestinian society. It elicited brutal repression, reached its peak of savagery under the orders of Defense Minister Yitzhak Rabin, another admired dove. He informed a Peace Now delegation at the peak of the state crimes that meaningless U.S. dialogue with the PLO was designed to grant Israel, I'm quoting him, at least a year to suppress the uprising by force. The inhabitants of the territories are subject to harsh military and economic pressure. Rabin explained that in the end they will be broken, abandoning their hopes for a life of dignity. Gaza was placed under closure at that time, breaking any connection to the rest of Palestine. This was extended shortly after within the framework of the Oslo Accords of 1993, which, if anyone cares, declared that Gaza and the West Bank are an indivisible territorial unity which cannot be separated. U.S. and Israel were doing the opposite. And that remains U.S.-Israeli policy to the present. It's quite significant. Separation of the two regions guarantees that if any limited autonomy is gained in the West Bank, it will have no access to the outside world except through Jordan. And that's being barred by the systematic expulsion of the inhabitants of the Jordan Valley, expulsions that the Israeli press accurately calls tihur babika, purification of the valley, cleansing of the valley. These are programs that have slowly reduced its population from 300,000 in 1967 to less than 60,000 today. They continue steadily with extreme cruelty. We'll soon be commemorating the 20th anniversary of the Oslo Accords. They were hailed at the time as a historic breakthrough on the path towards resolution of the Israel-Palestine conflict, and not universally hailed, of course, certainly not by prominent Palestinian figures who could see easily what's happening. Among them was Raja Shahada. He was Palestine's leading legal specialist. He'd been trying in vain for years to block Israel's violations of international law in the territories. And he recognized right away that the accords were a surrender in the interests of Israel and the Tunis-based PLO leadership, which was being marginalized within the territories, but is now restored to power through the side channel in Oslo. Another one was Edward Said, who saw exactly what was happening and condemned the capitulation at once. Another was historian Rashid Khalidi. He was actually an advisor to the Palestinian negotiators at the Madrid negotiations. He described the Oslo agreements as an infernal trap. Still another was Haider Abdel-Shafi, who's probably the most respected Palestinian within the territories. He headed the Palestinian delegation at the US-run Madrid negotiations, and he refused to capitulate to US-Israeli demands. He insisted that any agreement must at the very least bar illegal Israeli settlement in the territories. That issue was ignored at Oslo, and Abdel-Shafi refused to attend the signing of the ceremony on the White House lawn, described as a day of awe in the American press. There were many illusions about Gaza, but no basis for them whatsoever. To understand what was taking place, it was sufficient to read the short several pages of the Declaration of Principles, the document that emerged. These were quite explicit about satisfying Israel's demands and completely silent on Palestinian national rights. Article 1 of the Declaration states that the end result of the process, notice the end result when everything's finished, is to be a permanent settlement based on Security Council resolutions 242 and 338. Anyone familiar with diplomacy knows that these resolutions say nothing at all about Palestinian rights, apart from a vague reference to just settlement of the refugee problem, no mention of Palestinians. There are UN resolutions referring to Palestinian national rights, but these were ignored in the Declaration of Principles. So if the culmination of the peace process would be as clearly articulated in the Declaration of Principles, then Palestinians could kiss goodbye to any hopes for some meaningful form of autonomy, of national rights in the former Palestine. The assault on the people of Gaza mounted very sharply in January 2006, when Palestinians committed one of their major crimes. In the first free election in the Arab world, they voted the wrong way. Such insubordination conflicts very sharply with the really existing passion for democracy that's regularly proclaimed by Western leaders and the political class. And at once, the US and Israel, with Europe toddling obediently behind, as it usually does, instituted harsh measures to punish the miscreants. Actually, punishment became even more severe a year later when Gazans committed an even worse crime. Immediately after the elections, with their unwelcome outcome, Washington turned to standard operating procedure when criminal populations vote improperly. Prepare a military coup. This was to be led by Fatah strongman Mohammed Dahlan. The elected government preempted the coup. That's an event denounced in the West as Hamas's violent takeover of Gaza, the context suppressed. It's bad enough to vote the wrong way in a free election, but preventing a US-run military coup to overthrow the government, that's a truly unspeakable crime. And accordingly, the siege and the other punishments were sharply increased in retaliation. We then move on to Operation Cast Lead, other atrocities. I won't review the shocking story, which Westerners should know by heart, given their critical role throughout. Well, throughout these years, Gaza has been a showcase for violence of every imaginable kind. The record shows such sadistic and very carefully planned atrocities as Operation Cast Lead, called infanticide by the Norwegian physician Mats Gilbert, who worked tirelessly at Gaza's Al-Shifa hospital with his dedicated Palestinian and Norwegian colleagues right through the criminal assault. The term infanticide is appropriate. Hundreds of children were massacred. And from there, the violence ranges through just about every kind of cruelty that humans have used their higher mental faculties to devise, up to the pain of exile that Edward Said wrote about so eloquently. This is particularly stark in Gaza, where older people can still look across the border towards the homes a few miles away from which they were driven. Or, to be more precise, they could do that if they were able to approach the border without being killed. One form of punishment has been to close off the Gaza side of the border. That includes almost half the arable land, according to the leading academic scholar of Gaza, Harvard's Sarah Roy. While a showcase for the human capacity for violence and humiliation, Gaza is also an inspiring exemplar of the demand for dignity. The first phrase one hears in Gaza when asking about personal aspirations is for a life of dignity. The distinguished human rights lawyer, internationally known human rights lawyer, Raji Sourani, writes from his Gaza home that what has to be kept in mind is that the occupation and the absolute closure is an ongoing attack on the human dignity of the people in Gaza in particular, and all Palestinians generally. It is systematic degradation, humiliation, isolation, fragmentation of the Palestinian people. While bombs were once again raining down on defenseless civilians in Gaza last November, he repeated that we demand justice and accountability. We dream of a normal life in freedom and dignity. And others perceive the same reality. In The Lancet, leading international medical journal, a visiting Stanford physician who was appalled by what he witnessed described Gaza as something of a laboratory for observing an absence of dignity, a condition that has devastating effects on physical, mental, and social well-being. Still quoting him, the constant surveillance from the sky, collective punishment through blockade and isolation, the intrusion into homes and communications, restrictions on those trying to travel or marry or work, make it difficult to live a dignified life in Gaza. A young woman professional who managed to escape from Gaza to Canada, doctor there, Ghada Agil is her name. She writes about her a couple of weeks ago, about her 87-year-old grandmother who's still trapped in the Gaza prison. Before her expulsion, she writes, she owned a house, farms, and land, and she enjoyed honor, dignity, and hope. And amazingly, like Palestinians rather generally, she hasn't given up hope. So Agil continues, when I saw my grandmother in November 2012, she was unusually happy, right in the midst of the latest atrocities. Surprised by her high spirits, I asked for an explanation. She looked me in the eye and, to my surprise, said that she was no longer worried about her native village and the life of dignity that she has lost, for her irrevocably. When I see you, her grandmother said, I know that our native village, long ago destroyed, is in your heart, and I also know that you're not alone in your journey. Don't be discouraged, we're getting there. The call for dignity resounds through the Arab Spring, which, despite all of its uncertain outcomes, is doubtless a development of historic significance. Prominent Lebanese commentator Rami Khouri writes that the process at hand now in Tunisia and Egypt will continue to ripple through the entire Arab world as ordinary citizens realize that they must seize and protect their birthrights of freedom and dignity. The uprising, as you know, was sparked by the self-immolation of Muhammad Bouazizi in reaction to his humiliating and degrading treatment. Muhammad did what he did for the sake of his dignity, his mother recounts. On the anniversary of his suicide, a cart statue, sold things from a cart. The cart statue was unveiled in his honor in the town where he carried out the action that triggered the uprising and spread throughout Middle East, North Africa. The ceremony was attended by Tunisia's first elected president, who thanked him and those he inspired for bringing dignity to the entire Tunisian people. Now, in the oil dictatorships, the uprisings have been suppressed, often by violence, much to the relief of Western powers, but not entirely. So in Kuwait, while protesters were fleeing from the riot police, a Kuwaiti political scientist commented that People want dignity and political participation and equality before the law, and not a revolution. Not the Kuwaiti citizens, at least. The great majority who do the work might have other ideas in mind. Such driving sentiments of oppressed people extend far beyond the Arab Spring. We've just passed the centenary of the great textile strike of immigrant workers in Lawrence, Massachusetts, near where I live, led by the Wobblies, who played a leading role in the labor movement until it was crushed a few years later by Woodrow Wilson's Red Scare. The strikers won the strike under the banner "Bread and Roses," now a famous slogan, sustenance and dignity. And today, immigrant workers and immigrant activists in the United States organize in what they call the Immigrant Dignity Campaign. The lively labor press of the early Industrial Revolution bitterly condemned the rising industrial system for depriving those driven to the mills of their dignity as free human beings. The early 1970s witnessed the last militant strike wave in the United States before the labor movement has once again been crushed under the neoliberal assault on the population, which is taking place everywhere. You're suffering from it here. The strikes were a call for bread and roses, for workers' control of the workplace so that they could uphold their basic dignity. And that continues today with the spread of worker-owned enterprises and cooperatives on a rather impressive scale. These aspirations have been suppressed by violence throughout history, but the spark's never extinguished, and it continues to burst into flames. The search for dignity is understood instinctively by those who hold the clubs and who recognize that apart from violence, the best way to undermine it is by humiliation. That's second nature in prisons everywhere. It reaches its sordid extreme in places like Bagram and Guantanamo, portrayed unforgettably by Victoria Britton, who's recently broadened the shameful picture to include the fate of the women left behind. The normal practice in Israeli prisons has gained some attention in the last couple of weeks because of the concern that it might spark another uprising, third intifada, after the death of a young man, Arafat Jaradat. He was arrested at his home at midnight, of course. That's to properly intimidate the family. He was charged with having thrown stones and a Molotov cocktail a few months earlier during Israel's November attack on Gaza. He was healthy and vigorous when arrested. He was last seen alive in court by his lawyer, who describes him as doubled over, scared, confused, and shrunken. The court reacted by remanding him to another 12 days of what's called interrogation, and he was found dead in his cell. Israeli journalist Amira Haas writes that Palestinians do not need an Israeli investigation. For them, Jaradat's death is much bigger than the tragedy he and his family have suffered. From their experience, Jaradat's death is proof that the Israeli system routinely uses torture, and from their experience, they know that the goal of torture is not only to convict someone, but to deter and subjugate an entire people by humiliation, degradation, terror, familiar features of repression at home and abroad. And Europeans should not overlook their willing and significant participation in the latest phase of Washington's reign of torture. I say latest phase because there are ample precedents. The Open Society Institute just released its study called Globalizing Torture, a CIA secret detentions, and extraordinary rendition. You know what that means, sending people to the most miserable dictatorships that can be tortured properly without us saying we're doing it. The study reveals that 54 countries participated in the campaign. That included most of Europe and most of the rest of the world. Actually, one region of the world was exempt, Latin America. Virtually alone, it refused to participate in globalizing torture. And that's quite a remarkable fact. Only a few years ago, Latin America remained Washington's obedient backyard, did what it was told. And it was also, during this period, one of the torture capitals of the world, and not any longer. One can easily see why Western elites are so concerned about the threat of democracy and so committed to limiting it, most recently in the Middle East. The need for humiliating those who raise their heads is an ineradicable element of the imperial mentality. Just cite one typical case. There's a highly regarded liberal commentator of the New York Times, also a Mideast specialist, Thomas Friedman. He was asked on TV for his recommendations for the US-UK occupying army in Iraq a couple of months after the invasion. And his answer was elegant and forthright. I'll quote him. He said, "We needed to go over there, basically, take out a very big stick right in the heart of that world. What Muslims needed to see was American boys and girls going from house to house, from Basra to Baghdad, and saying, 'Which part of this sentence don't you understand? You don't think we care about our open society? You think this bubble of terrorism fantasy, we're just going to let it grow? Well, suck on this,' namely what they did. So in short, a severe dose of humiliation administered by American boys and girls will teach the terrified women and children whose houses they break into, teach them that they better stop terrorizing us. Well, as usual, it elicited a little comment, apart from people who are called misguided sentimentalists. The need not just to control, but also to humiliate the victims is second nature to political leaders as well, as case after case. One interesting case was in 1988. It's the year when the Palestinian National Council formally accepted the international consensus on a two-state settlement. The U.S. by then was becoming an international laughingstock with its unwillingness to hear Yasser Arafat's call for peaceful diplomacy. And the reasons were explained by Secretary of State George Shultz in his memoirs, also a respected statesman. He informed his boss, Ronald Reagan, that Arafat was saying in one place, unk, unk, and he was saying in another place, cl, cl, cl. But nowhere will he yet bring himself to say uncle in the style of abject surrender that's demanded of the lower orders. Well, Israel actually did hear the call for a political settlement, and it reacted at once by declaring that there can be no additional Palestinian state between Israel and Jordan. Jordan's a Palestinian state by Israeli fiat, whatever misguided Jordanians and Palestinians might think. Washington very quickly endorsed Israel's reaction. It's the James Baker Plan of December 1989. All of this has been quite effectively excised from history. There's no need to sample the reflexive resort to the principle in imperial history. One case that probably has not been forgotten by the victims is the attitudes of the Anglo-Iranian oil company administrators towards what they called the WOGs during the glory days of the company. In their words, the only way to handle the WOGs is to browbeat them, to cow them into submission. with the iron fist always poised when such gentler means do not suffice. Iran's brave and dignified leader, Mohammad Mossadegh, was subjected to ugly abuse and humiliation by the British government and the educated classes in the US too, because he sought to implement Iran's right to take control of its own resources. These incidentally are called our resources in internal documents, which by accident happened to be somewhere else. Mossadegh was a dedicated constitutionalist. He insisted on keeping the completely nonviolent means like Allende, and he paid for it with the US-UK military coup in 1953, which was greatly lauded in the West. So the New York Times editors, for example, soberly explained that underdeveloped countries with rich resources now have an object lesson in the heavy cost that must be paid by one of their number, which goes berserk with fanatical nationalism. It's perhaps too much to hope that Iran's experience will prevent the rise of Mossadeghs in other countries, but that experience may at least strengthen the hands of more reasonable and more far-seeing leaders who will have a clear-eyed understanding of the principles of decent behavior, meaning crawl properly and say uncle when you're supposed to. And it did for many years, though by the 1970s, the tide of independent nationalism could no longer be crushed by violence. These attitudes are so close to the surface that they break through at the slightest provocation. That happened at once when the WAGs asserted their rights in the early 70s and sought to overcome the sharp decline in oil prices relative to other commodities, which had been so beneficial to the West, thanks to its effective controls. Influential intellectual Irving Kristol, he's one of the godfathers of contemporary conservatism, he wrote that insignificant nations, like insignificant people, can quickly experience delusions of significance, which have to be driven from their primitive minds by force. In truth, he explained, the days of gunboat diplomacy are never over. Gunboats are as necessary for international order as police cars are for domestic orders. Thoughts widely echoed. Sometimes humiliation can take slightly more subtle forms. One was the topic of a lecture here 2 years ago in honor of Edward Said by Rashid Khalidi. His title was Human Dignity in Jerusalem. Perhaps some of you heard it. Khalidi discussed a project of the Simon Wiesenthal Center, which is dedicated to promotion of human rights and dignity. The project was to build a center for human dignity in Jerusalem. The site they chose is the Mamilla Cemetery in Jerusalem, the most venerated Muslim burial place in Palestine, where companions of the Prophet are reputedly buried, many other honored figures. Actually, parts had already been taken for a parking lot on the site of Israel's Independence Square. The idea of desecrating a cemetery to construct a center for human dignity could only occur to people so dedicated to humiliation of their victims that they can't perceive what they're doing. There was an appeal to bar the project. It was denied by the Israeli Supreme Court. Well, finally, I'd like to say a few words on how these themes, which just run through history, how they arise in the foreign policy issues that are of primary significance for U.S. policymakers and for the U.S. political class, at least if we judge by the presidential debates, Chuck Hagel senatorial hearings, and the coverage they've received. There was a foreign policy debate, the last of the debates before the election. The two contestants The two countries predominated overwhelmingly, Israel and Iran. Obama and Romney, two candidates, vied with each other in proclaiming their undying loyalty to Israel and in identifying Iran as the gravest threat to world peace. In the Hagel hearings, there were 136 mentions of Israel, 135 of Iran, scattered mention of other countries and foreign policy issues. Hagel was berated by the Republicans, and it's crucial to remember that it was the Republicans, for being insufficiently loyal to Israel and not sufficiently dedicated to bombing Iran if it does not capitulate. Well, in the case of Israel, there's been a near unanimous international consensus on a diplomatic settlement. It's been blocked by the United States for 35 years with tacit European acceptance. I've mentioned some of the reasons. Contempt for the worthless victims is no small part of the barrier to achieving a settlement with at least a modicum of justice and respect for human dignity and rights. It's not beyond imagination that the barrier can be overcome. It'll take dedicated work, as has happened in other cases. On Iran, I'd like to suggest to you, if you're not familiar with it, a fine talk by John Snow about a year ago at the Chatham House. Snow knows Iran very well. He had much of interest to say. His main point was that the West must overcome its contempt for Iran and its people. He ended the talk by calling for esteem, esteem, esteem. We should respect Iran, its history, its civilization, while also making it quite clear that we condemn its government. We should engage with Iran by trade, cultural interchange, other measures. He brings up one highly successful case, a cooperative exhibition of Iranian artistic treasures by the British Museum and Iran. Actually, there's another example, more recent. There was an international congress in Tehran last October on HIV/AIDS. American scientists participated. Just a couple weeks ago was the annual meeting of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the main scientific organization. The US participants in the Tehran conference described Iran as a model for the rest of the region in its response to AIDS, and added that we can learn a lot from what Iranians are doing, or could, they add, if it weren't for the fact that these efforts are now being severely undermined by the harsh sanctions. But going back to Snow, the most important step he emphasized would be to overcome the contempt that has guided the West for a century. It's primarily Britain, the United States, since it largely replaced Britain in 1953, when the two overthrew the parliamentary government, installed the harsh tyranny of the Shah. I won't review the disgraceful record of contempt and purposeful humiliation. Actually, it's explored in depth in a new book, the best scholarly study of the coup, Ervand Abrahamian's very revealing work, which just appeared. It should evoke shame and deep regret in Britain and the United States. And we should also remember that in the last 60 years, not a single day has passed when the US and Britain were not brutally punishing Iranians. First by installing and backing the Shah, then by supporting Saddam Hussein's aggression, then harsh sanctions, now the open threat of war, which is a violation of the UN Charter, if any sentimentalists among you care. The current issue is Iran's nuclear programs. Interesting to ask who shares the Western perception, actually obsession, that this is the greatest threat to world peace. And that question's pretty easy to answer. The obsession is not shared by the the non-aligned countries, it's most of the world, they continue their vigorous support, outspoken support for Iran's right to enrich uranium as signers of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. It's not shared in the Arab world, where the population dislikes Iran for all kind of reasons that go way back, but does not consider it much of a threat. Now, the population does perceive threats, primarily Israel and the United States. The people I'm talking about. Western commentary keeps to the oil dictators who do see Iran as a threat. This helps explain why the West is so opposed to democracy in the Arab world. If you had any, disregarding the usual boilerplate, if you have some kind of functioning democracy, public opinion has some sort of influence on policy. And the last thing that the West wants is for policy to focus on the threats that are perceived of the US and Israel, and not on the threat that the West is obsessed with, the alleged threat of Iran. Well, secondly, whatever the threat's alleged to be, is there a way to address it, short of sanctions that punish the population and war? Well, there are a number of possibilities. One approach would be to try to revive the Tehran Agreement of May 2010. Then Iran accepted a Turkish-Brazilian proposal to send a low-enriched uranium for storage abroad in Turkey, and to have the nuclear powers satisfy Iran's needs for its medical reactors. The US government and the media bitterly condemned Turkey and Brazil for overcoming the greatest threat to world peace. And Obama quickly rushed through new sanctions at the United Nations. The US refused to accept yes for an answer, as quoting Muhammad al-Baradei, the former head of the International Atomic Energy Agency. The Brazilian foreign minister was rather annoyed by this, and he released a letter from Obama to President Lula da Silva of Brazil, proposing exactly what Turkey and Brazil had achieved. Presumably, Obama was assuming that Iran would reject the proposal and get some propaganda points. The incident was glossed over rather quietly, but the option may remain, one of several. And there's also a broader approach to the problem, which is worth thinking seriously about. It was actually proposed by the non-aligned conference that met in Tehran last August. It renewed a long-standing proposal, which has been vigorously advanced by Egypt in particular for many years, and has such overwhelming international support that Washington has been compelled to express its formal agreement, but only formal reservations that can't do it. It's also supported by some of the most prominent US and Israeli strategic analysts. That proposal would be to move towards establishing a nuclear weapons-free zone in the region. If even steps were taken towards that, it would mitigate whatever crisis is perceived, might be a way to end them. Well, an opportunity to carry forward the program arose last December. An international conference was to be held in Finland to move towards implementation under UN auspices. In November, Iran agreed to attend. A few days later, Obama canceled the conference. The core issue, of course, is that the US will not allow Israel's nuclear weapons to be subject to inspection or even discussion. Well, a few days after Obama canceled the conference, the UN General Assembly passed a resolution calling on Israel to join the Non-Proliferation Treaty, 174-6. Joining Israel in voting no were the United States, Canada, several US Pacific Island dependencies. I didn't check, but I suspect that Britain abstained. The U.S. then proceeded to carry out a nuclear weapons test, once again banning international inspectors from the test site. Shortly after that, a meeting took place under the auspices of the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. It's an offshoot of the Israeli lobby. The press likes to pretend that they're independent experts. There was an enthusiastic report in the Israeli press. It said that Dennis Ross, Elliot Abrams, other former top advisors to Obama and Bush assured the audience that the president, I'm quoting it, the president will strike Iran next year if diplomacy doesn't succeed. Well, one reason why diplomacy won't succeed is that there's no protest against what's happening. And there can't be any protest for the failure of diplomacy or efforts to seek to end the greatest threat to world peace for a very simple reason. Hardly a word about these recent events, in fact, virtually nothing, has been reported in the United States. It's another interesting illustration of how free speech can be restricted in a very free society with essentially no government coercion. I haven't investigated, but I suspect that the same is true here. You can tell me. There are other possibilities. None can be seriously pursued unless the powerful are capable of learning to respect the dignity of their victims. If this is beyond their means, impassable barriers will remain, and the world will be doomed to violence, cruelty, and bitter suffering.